Christmas is normally a time for peace, families, and friends to get together, celebrate with one another, and whatever they believe in, and get ready for the new year. But for one Welsh noble family in 1175, Christmas wasn't the peaceful occasion they planned for, because it ended with their brutal deaths. Happy holidays, APHOUT fans! In today's episode, we're going to talk about the Christmas massacre at Abergavenny Castle back in the early medieval period. And this reference will date me horribly, but for you Game of Thrones fans out there, the massacre reminds me very much of the Red Wedding. We've got feuding clans coming together to celebrate, one group deciding to attack the other during a big event, and of course lots of death. Like we normally do, we'll start with the historical context. What does 12th century Wales look like? And after we get a good idea of what medieval Welsh politics was like, we'll dive into the event itself and the aftermath, because you just know that there is going to be retribution for all that Christmas time murder. And what better way to celebrate the holidays than with a massacre, right? This is Christmas, APHOUT style. So let's get started. Wales today, as most of you know, is part of the United Kingdom, which is England and Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. But it wasn't always that way. In fact, at the time of today's story in 1175, Wales hadn't yet been conquered by the English king, Edward I, a Plantagenet king. Prior to all that, in the 12th century, Wales was divided into a few kingdoms, and I promise you I am going to be trying my best with pronunciation in today's episode. So, we've got three main kingdoms, the kingdoms of Gwynedd, Deheubarth, and Powys. And hey, my father-in-law lives in Powys. Hey, Dad! I hope I'm pronouncing your county properly. And if you know anything about medieval politics, or frankly just politics in general, when you've got a bunch of rival kingdoms all shoved together in a small space, we can normally assume that they're going to be at war with each other. It's always a delicate balance, sharing a small landmass like that. Each rival house is going to want more land and power, so inevitably it leads to conflict. We see that happening in the world right now, right? Conflict between two or more rival powers that want control over the same piece of land for whatever reason, whether it's access to resources or political legitimacy or cultural supremacy, you name it. But anyways, in Wales, you've got these three main kingdoms, Gwynedd in the northwest, Powys in the northeast and also a good chunk of the middle, and then Deheubarth in the southwest. And despite being rival powers, after a while they actually worked together to try to reclaim some stability for the people. Because outside of these three kingdoms, to the south and the east in Wales, were the Normans, who were changing everything. The Normans invaded England in 1066 with William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings, and it was the Normans who brought feudalism over to England, building their castles everywhere, subjugating the Anglo-Saxons, all that good stuff. And by the end of the 11th century, that's the thousands, the same century they had arrived, they had begun raids in Wales. The full takeover happened later in the 13th century, some 200 years later. So that's something to consider as well. You've got Welsh kingdoms vying for control against each other, but also now the Normans, taking portions of lands that bordered England. The Norman area was known as the Marches, while the Welsh portion, ruled by those three main kingdoms, was known as Cadwalladr, to distinguish them from the invaders. And the name Marches stuck, by the way, and refers to the counties that border England, like Shropshire and Herefordshire. So let's zoom in on Abergavenny then. Abergavenny is in southeastern Wales, not too far from the border, so therefore not in Cadwalladr, not in the Welsh lands controlled by the kingdoms. Instead, it was in Norman territory in a kingdom known as Gwent. Are there any Witcher 3 fans who just had their ears perk up when I said Gwent? Because when I was doing my research for this episode and discovered that a massacre happened in a castle named Gwent, or rather in a county named Gwent, I was super excited. But anywho, Abergavenny Castle was built in 1087 by a man named Hamlin de Balin, who served as its first Norman lord. It was a Motte and Bailey style castle, and let's talk a little bit about Motte and Bailey style architecture because I think it's pretty cool. So typically, motte and bailey castles were wooden structures, maybe with some stone parts built. Sure, stone castles would be better than wood for so many reasons, and the Normans built stone castles as well, but the wooden motte and baileys could be built faster, so they were usually the first ones erected. If we think about what the Normans are doing in England and Wales, engaging in territorial expansion, trying to overpower the Anglo-Saxons and other groups, then they needed to build castles and structures quickly. Hence, wooden motte and baileys. And once established, and when the Normans fully controlled the area, sometimes they would then invest the time and the materials and the money to replace those motte and baileys with stone castles. Now, the motte part was a raised hill, or mound, where the keep would be built. This places the lord or ruler of the castle literally higher than everyone else, making it easier for them to keep an eye on the people they wanted to subjugate. There was also definitely an intimidation factor here. If I'm up high, I can see you, so don't do anything stupid, right? When you think of medieval castles, you're probably picturing a motte and bailey castle. The bailey part was the rest of the castle town enclosed in walls at the foot of the mound and keep. This is where the soldiers and servants would live, typically. We would not expect the locals to live there, or peasants, or anyone like that. They would be outside of the walls. And occasionally, where possible, a moat was built around the whole structure, motte and bailey and all, to keep out the riffraff, but also serve as an additional defense. Now, it is a castle, so yes, it's there as a defensive structure, but again, the main point of a Norman motte and bailey castle was to maintain control over the people of that area. Abergavenny was one of those, built by the Normans in 1087, only 21 years after they first arrived in England with William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. They're moving quickly. And once Norman castles were built to establish control over that area within Gwent, they fanned out and they engaged in territorial expansion, taking even more land. And in 1175, Abergavenny was the site of a Christmas Day Massacre, where tensions between different houses in southern Wales, some Welsh, some Norman, erupted and resulted in tragedy. There are a bunch of characters in our story, but I'm going to simplify them to the main ones just to make it easier to keep track. Our story begins back in the 1160s with another death, that of Henry Fitzmiles, the Lord of Abergavenny at that time. Fitzmiles and his only son were killed, and it was thought that Seisyll ap Dyfnwal, a Welshman with lands of his own a few miles away, was responsible. And for those of you just listening to this episode, you will have no idea how that man's name is spelled. For those of you watching on YouTube, Seisyll ap Dyfnwal. So, why did Seisyll kill him? Well, don't forget we've got conflict between the Welsh and the Norman invaders. Seisyll had ties to the kingdom of Dyfnwal, one of the pure Wally Welsh domains over in the west, and Henry Fitzmiles was part Norman, and therefore seen as one of the invading outsiders. Fitzmiles didn't have any surviving male heirs, so nobody in his family line to take over from him upon his death. This would potentially mean that another family could take control of Abergavenny. Did Seisyll do this in hopes that he might take control, swiping some lands from the Norman invaders and reclaiming it for the Welsh? Probably. Some sources I've read say that Seisyll got control of the castle for a while, but eventually the king gave Abergavenny to Fitzmiles' nephew, William de Braose. So now that de Braose was Lord of Abergavenny, he came up with a plan for retribution. Christmas, traditionally, was a time when local squabbles would be put on pause. Families would come together to peacefully celebrate in hopes that they could put aside their differences for the new year. So typically, when you're invited to a lord's castle on Christmas, and we're talking in the medieval period, you leave your weapons at the door, right? If it's a time for forging peace, you don't need swords or bows with you. That, it's not good guest, right? You don't show up to a place covered in weapons. That's a little intimidating. Braose invited Seisyll and his oldest son Geoffrey, that one's easier to say, and other family members and his knights and whatnot to dine with him at Abergavenny to clear the air, to get out any grievances, and start the new year fresh. And as customary, Seisyll and the other guests left their weapons outside. Other Gwent Welsh leaders were supposedly invited too, but the story focuses on this beef between Braose and Seisyll. Now, once the men were all inside, defenseless, Braose locked the doors and massacred them. Here's how one author recounts the story. I read this in Chris Barber's 1941 book, The Seven Hills of Abergavenny, which, to be fair, is a walking tour book, but it contains really cool anecdotes from people who grew up in that area with the stories, so I consider it a form of oral history. Quote, "The guests sat down at long tables loaded with food, and William Braose rose to his feet and welcomed the Welshmen to Abergavenny Castle. But after the goblets had been passed around, he changed the tone of his voice and announced that henceforth all the Welsh of his domain should be deprived of the right to carry arms, and that all who were present should swear to abandon that right. His guests were deeply shocked by his words, and no doubt stared at him in astonishment, for they had come here that night in good faith and had not expected such a demand. Then Braose gave a pre-arranged signal, and soldiers, led by the Sheriff of Hereford, rushed into the hall with gleaming swords in their hands. The Welshmen now rose to their feet in horror. Without their weapons, they were unable to defend themselves, and they were savagely cut to pieces. Their blood mingled with the wine that they had been drinking, and one by one, they fell to the stone floor until the massacre was complete." End quote. So in short, all of the guests were killed, and I've read there were around 70 of them. But not content with killing off just Seisyll's family members in attendance, William Braose sought out the only surviving heir who didn't attend the feast, Seisyll's 7-year-old son, Cadwalladr. And poor young Cadwalladr was slaughtered as well. Seisyll's wife was taken from the castle also, only a few miles away from Abergavenny, but she disappears from the historical record, so we can only make assumptions about what happened to her. Now, in the same book I quoted just a minute ago, the author writes that, quote, "When William Braose's men came to murder Seisyll's son, they set fire to the wooden fortress and took the grief-stricken widow, Anharad, back to Abergavenny Castle, where she no doubt died in the castle's dungeons." End quote. I mean, it's as good a guess as any. For perpetrating this bloody, deceitful Christmas Day massacre, William Braose earns the nickname the Ogre of Abergavenny. Well earned, in my opinion. But the Normans did not see him as the one to blame. A Norman priest and historian named Gerald of Wales wrote a book called Journey into Wales in 1188, where he essentially said that the king ordered that attack, and William Braose therefore wasn't responsible. Now, obviously, we're looking at biased sources on both sides. The Welsh will see Braose as a monster, and the Normans, or the English, will see him as a hero, trying to hold his ground against the Welsh. And when we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, the conflict over the Welsh versus Norman control over these southern Welsh marches, then the whole thing makes a little bit more sense. The Welsh will see the Norman-controlled Abergavenny as tyranny, outsiders coming to take their land away. And the Normans will see the Welsh as backward folk who need to be controlled and conquered. Abergavenny was just one of many, many battlegrounds between the Welsh and the Norman English. Now, even though William Braose was successful in avenging his uncle's death, you can imagine that this vengeance didn't sit well with the other Welsh lords in and around Gwent. Some historians note that Braose knew this and was hoping to cause instability on purpose so he could potentially seize more land and power, which is a very likely move. But one thing is clear, it made the tension between the Welsh and the Normans in southeastern Wales even worse. In retribution, Seisyll and the other slain lords' descendants attacked the castle in 1182. Braose was not there at the time, so the Welsh couldn't get the revenge that they were seeking. But Abergavenny was set on fire, and most of Braose's men were taken hostage. The castle was later rebuilt, and over time, ownership went back and forth between the Welsh and the English. As I hinted at earlier in the episode, the Welsh were eventually conquered a little more than a century after the Christmas Day Massacre, but in the ensuing years, Wales was no longer divided into rival houses. They actually united under Llewellyn the Great, who became Prince of Wales in 1194. Not the modern title Prince of Wales like the English monarchy, but a single ruler that the Welsh rallied behind. Now, under his leadership, the Welsh drove the English out of northern Wales in 1212, and then actually pushed into English territory for a bit. Llewellyn and his heirs fought back against the English king Henry III, resisting any further conquest and maintaining their borders, which is great. But things turned against the Welsh in 1272 when Henry III died and his son Edward I took over, because Edward really wanted to conquer the Welsh, so he organized a series of large-scale invasions to conquer them once and for all. Llewellyn II, grandson of the original Llewellyn the Great, couldn't withstand the massive English army and was forced to capitulate. And over the next 2 decades, Wales was essentially defeated and turned into an English colony by 1284. And centuries later, in 1536, Henry VIII incorporated Wales into England, and today, England and Wales together remain as one of 3 jurisdictions of the UK, alongside Scotland and Northern Ireland. So even to this day, Wales is just absorbed into England, though many Welsh people maintain a distinct identity, language, and culture, as evidenced by my attempts to pronounce Welsh throughout this entire episode. And when we look back in history at the Christmas Day Massacre, alone, it's just a really gnarly event that might have inspired the Red Wedding of Game of Thrones. But when we look at the context of the times, what happened at Abergavenny was a microcosm of the broader Welsh-Norman tensions that eventually led to the English conquest of Wales, forever changing the fate of the Welsh people. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelli Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Christmas Massacre at Abergavenny. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things, subscribe to APHOUT on YouTube, and check out the musician who created the song you're hearing right now, Yellowcake. You can find him everywhere as Nedrick and Nedrick Music, and links for all of that are in the description. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped, and stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.